Hey guys, welcome to part 4 of my tutorial on how to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. This part is about memorization. Part 2 of this tutorial was also about memorization, but it was about how to identify what your letters are on the cube while memorizing. This part, on the other hand, is about how to remember those letters until the end of the solve. I think one of the shortcomings of some of the blindfolded tutorials I've seen is that they don't start people off with good memorization methods. I see a lot of tapping and I see a lot of color identification, and those kinds of techniques at one point may have been considered good, but right now I really don't know of anyone who's very fast who uses those techniques, and I don't think they're right for most people. Instead, I'm going to be teaching you how to memorize with letter pairs. So the first part of this video is going to be about the techniques you'll use for memorization, and the second part of this video is about the structure of memorization. And I think this is a very important topic for people who are just starting out, because a lot of people get discouraged early because they don't have a good memorization system. So here we go. So all that letter pairs mean is that you construct your memorization words where each one encodes 2 letters. So one of the advantages when you're memorizing letter pairs is that when you're using M2, you know very quickly whether something is an even target or an odd target. So you know if something is the first target of a letter pair, then you're going to do the normal algorithm for it. But if it's the second algorithm of a letter pair, then you're going to do the inverse algorithm for it. And another advantage is for parity. You know you have parity when you just have this sort of awkward floating letter at the end of your memorization, and it's not paired with any other letter. So I'm going to be talking about 2 different kinds of memorization. Memorization using images and memorization using sounds. And I'm going to be showing you guys how to use letter pairs for both of those. So basically a letter pair just means that you have 2 letters and you want to memorize them with 1 word. The most basic way to do that is to take a very simple word that starts with one of the letters and ends with the second letter, or starts with the first letter. So for example, if I wanted to memorize BL, I might use the word ball, or I might use the word bull, or something along those lines. So the first technique that I'm going to show you is images. And so for an image, you want to think of the most vivid image you can think of for that pair of letters. So for BL, I would probably do bull, and I would imagine in my head a sneering, angry bull, because that for me is the most vivid image that I can think of that easily incorporates those 2 letters. So the goal of an image is not only to be vivid so that you'll remember it more easily, but another goal is for it to be personal, something that only means something to you. So for example, if you get the letters J-O, maybe your image for that is Joe, your best friend, who you know very well and you can imagine what he looks like. And perhaps the rest of your image will involve him performing, whatever actions come up next. So a lot of people recommend writing down a letter pair list for these kinds of images. I'm just going to say that I never did that. It might be helpful for you. All I did was every time I came to a new letter pair, I just thought of the best image I could think of. And if I couldn't think of a great image within enough time, after the solve I would think to myself and say, well, if I get that letter pair again, what image am I going to use? And so I very quickly, probably in a month maybe, built up sort of this inventory of letter pair words without ever having written them down. And so a good test to see whether a letter pair image is good is just to see if you remember it often in solves, or whether it's one of those words that you tend to forget. And if it's one that you tend to forget, it's probably time to change it to something a little more vivid. So more about that a little later. The second kind of letter pair memorization is audio. And that's where you just want every pair of 2 letters to form a 1-syllable sound. So, for example, BL could be bull or it could be ball. It doesn't really matter. you tend to want to use the same one every time just so that you get used to it. And the goal of audio memorization is to end up with a string of sounds so that that's easy for you to spit back out immediately. So you want your sounds to be distinct from each other, and you want to know what letters each sound encodes. So one danger using both of these kinds of methods is that you'll have two letters that are very similar. For example, for corners, you could have both QC and QK. And for that kind of thing, the best thing to do is just to know which is which. So for QC, I use quick, and for QK, I use quack. Or if I'm looking for a noun, I use quacker, which in my head refers to a duck. So even though quick and quack could both refer to QC or QK, I know that for me, QC is quick and QK is quack. So, and so for sounds, that's especially important when you have to very quickly be going through your sounds and instantly know what letter is what. So the key thing here is consistency, because if you use the same letter pair for the same word every time, you will end up just instantly knowing what letter pair refers to what word. But if you change it around, you're going to end up confusing yourself. So just one more note before I move on to the structure of memorization is that you're going to want your letter pair sounds to be all of them one syllable, whereas your letter pair images don't have to all be one syllable. And the sounds can also, of course, be nonsense because you're just going to be memorizing them as sounds. So on to the structure of Memo. So when you memorize, you're going to memorize the corners and edges separately, of course. And you're either going to memorize corners and then edges, or edges and then corners. So the thing to think about when you're doing this is which one do you want to be long-term memorization and which one do you want to be short-term memorization. Whichever one you memorize first, you're going to use long-term memorization for, or images. And whichever one you memorize second, you're going to use short-term memorization for, or sounds. So I personally memorize my corners first and then my edges, and then I execute my edges and I execute my corners. So how this works is you just think of, or what I do is I think of the most vivid image that I can that incorporates all of my corner images. And so I'm going to take my, 4 or 3 or 5 or however many image words that I have for my corners, and I'm going to make those images interact with each other in such a way that I get a very coherent total image, which I can just look at in my head. So it's not called an image because you're going to be saying the words over and over in your head. It's called an image because the goal is to be able to see it in front of you. And I think that's something that's extremely important, especially when you're starting out, is that for your image memorization, you want to be able to see the image throughout the whole solve. Even while you're memorizing edges, you want to be able to access that image. And that image, when you see it in your head, should instantly tell you exactly what your letters are for the corners. So then, once I've encoded that image in my head, I memorize my edges using audio, which is just a string of gibberish sounds. And I just start with the first pair, and I say it in my head, and then I add the second pair to it, and then the third, and then the fourth, and I end up with this long string of sounds, and then I execute the edges as quickly as I can before I lose the thread of this string of sounds. You can do the opposite and memorize your edges first, and then your corners, and then execute the corners and execute the edges. And how that would work is you would memorize your edges using images, trying to create the most coherent and interactive image as possible. And then you would memorize your corners using sounds. And then you would execute your corners first, and then you would execute your edges second. And you would execute your corners based on those sounds that you memorized, and then you would execute your edges based on the longer term image that's in your head. So I think the question to ask yourself about whether you want to use one method or the other is whether you're more of a visual person or an audio person. I know that there are plenty of people who have a lot of trouble memorizing all 12 edges using audio. I never had trouble with this. Back when I averaged about 5 minutes, I switched to audio edges, and the day that I switched, I dropped about a minute from my times. It was so easy for me to just spurt out this string of sounds and then remember it afterwards. For some people, though, the images stick better, and so then you'll want to do your edges for images. Of course, I'm talking about all this because there are 4 more edges than corners. So for me, I have a very quick image that I do, and then I have a really long string of sounds, and then I execute that really long string of sounds, and then I just have this neat little image to execute. But if you're more of the image kind of person, then you might want to memorize your edges first, and come up with a longer string of images, and then just have a very quick string of sounds for your corners. And so basically what you end up doing is having this longer term memorization for whatever you memorize first and execute last, and then for whatever's in the middle, you can just forget that memorization as soon as you're done executing it. So I'm just going to jump right in here and do an example solve, because I think that's probably what's going to be most instructive for you guys. So here I go. The Scramble is in the description. I recommend that you Scramble using your orientation so that you can follow this solve more easily. I'm going to be using my letter scheme though, and so it's more important that you follow what the letters are than what the actual memorization on the cube is. So if you're using a different memorization than me, just look at my letters and pretend like those letters are your letters. Okay, so I'm going to write down my memo here. Okay, so starting with the corners. Let's see. So I've got P, I, J, O, X, L. So P, I, and I'm going to write them down in pairs. J, O, X, L. And then I have a twisted corner back here, which I personally would just memorize as a sort of chameleon shape, because it creates a chameleon sort of OLL with the buffer, imagining that the buffer is, of course, twisted as well. If I were using letter pairs, though, I would do B, BQ. So I'll add that on to the end there. And so that's the corner memo, and then here is the edge memo. It's got, okay, X, N, H, D, X, N, H, D, S, F, P, B. S, F, P, B, and then I have to break into a new cycle, so I'll choose I, Q, O, A. So I, Q, O, A. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I would do it, and then I'll show you how you might do it if you are memorizing your edges first. So memorizing my corners first, I would go through and I would say PI. Okay, so I'm picturing a pie in my head, and then I would do JO, so I would imagine my friend Joe, and then I would XL. My image for that is extra large, so I would just make something in the image extra large, most likely the thing that comes after that, so I'll wait until the thing after that, and there's BQ, which my image for that is the vegetable bok choy. So my memorization here would be, okay, I've got a pie that's being eaten by my friend Joe, and on the pie there is an extra large bok choy. So I'd imagine a very large green bok choy vegetable. And so this image, I can look at it in my head. I can see, when I look at it, I can see the pie, and I can see my friend Joe, and I can see this big green vegetable thing on it. whatever that looks like. So I don't have to, in order to recall this piece of memorization, I don't actually have to think about the words. I can just look at it. I can just imagine in my head this picture frame that is showing me this image, and maybe I've added some background elements just to add context, like a table that he's eating it off of, or something like that. And so then I would, with this image in mind, move on to my edges, and I would just try to blast through my edges as quickly as possible. So my sounds for the edges are just, so my XN sound is shin, because if you've ever taken Chinese, you would know that in Chinese, when you're writing out the sound of a word in English, the X makes a sh sound. So my sound that I always use for XN is shin, and then my sound for HD is had, and then my sound for SF is safe, and then my sound for PB is pub, and then my sound for IQ is ick, and my sound for OA is just OA. So that one is 2 syllables, but it's sort of a quick 2 syllables. So now the important issue comes up of groupings. And so groupings are very important for your rhythm during an audio memorization. So there are 2 ways that I sometimes group my memorization, and it really just depends on how I'm feeling. I think for me they're both approximately equal. So sometimes what I might do is I might group them in groups of 2 letter pairs, and I would do shin had, safe pub, and then ikoa. And so there we have 3 2-syllable words, or in this case a sort of 2.5-syllable word, and that's what my rhythm would be. And then I would memorize the letters in those groupings. I would go XNHD, okay, shinhad, and then SFPB, safe pub, and then IQOA, ikoa, right? And so remember that the CK really stands for a Q. And so the other way that I sometimes do it is I do shinhad safe, and then pub ikoa. And so that's 2 words, but each word is 3 syllables. And so really it's just a question about what rhythm works the best for you. And so I would just go through these sounds, I would either end up with shin had safe pub ikoa, and then I would execute the edges, or I would end up with shin had safe pub ikoa, and then I would execute the edges as fast as I can. And so either way that you're doing it, you're ending up with this string of syllables that is only in your head for as long as you keep repeating it to yourself. So the best way probably to start out with this kind of thing, whether you're using this rhythm or this rhythm or this rhythm, is to just start with your first letter pair, and then and keep repeating that to yourself. So shin, okay, shin, whatever, shin. And then you get to your next letter pair, had, okay, shin had, shin had, shin had. And then you figure out your next letter pair, okay, safe. So shin had safe, shin had safe. And then you go to your next letter pair, and you keep repeating this to yourself. Eventually, you'll only have to repeat it 10 times. And then once you get better from there, you'll only have to repeat it 5 times. Once you get better from there, you only have to repeat it once or twice. I repeat it once, if at all. Sometimes I don't repeat it at all. I just identify and then execute. Of course, a lot of that depends on whether you're able to actually figure out what your letters are that quickly, but that's a different issue. So a few things just to look at here. Again, just sort of the examples of things that only make sense because that's how I use them every time. For example, ick. That could be IQ, IC, or IK. But I know that for IK I use Ike, and I know that for IC I use ice. So ick is the sound that works for me for IQ. You can use that if you want to, but there'll for sure be other letter pairs that you need to figure out on your own. And if you really have to, you can make a list, or you can just figure it out over time, what letter pairs work for you and what letter pairs don't. Okay, so then if you're memorizing your edges first, you might have a longer image. So for edges, I might memorize, okay, the shin had a safe on it. It just so happens that for xn, my image is also shin, just because shin is an actual image. If shin were a sound that didn't make sense at all in English, then I would have to find myself another image to use for xn. However, a shin is, a part of the leg, so I'll use that. So the shin had a safe on it. And so, of course, for HD, I would use an image if it didn't make so much sense just to put a verb there. The shin had a safe on it, and then the pub, as in like a bar, the pub's IQ, had an or. And so IQ, I tend to imagine something that's very smart, and playing on stereotypes, which can be very useful in blind solving. For something that's smart, I'll imagine it having glasses. So I'll imagine like a pub wearing glasses and then an oar in front, like a rowing oar. And so I'm not going to draw this picture because it's a lot more complicated. And then if you want to, you can even make the images interact with each other. For example, the shin had a safe on it, and then you can look into the safe, and there's the pub with the glasses that signifies its high IQ, and also an or in there. And then for corners, your corner memo could just be pi, joe, shul, because again, I use the sh sound for x, and then bach, pi, joe, shul, bach, whatever works for you. And then you execute pi, joe, shul, bach as quickly as you can, and then you go back and remember these images. So I really recommend that you try both of these ways out and see which one works better for you, whether it's the one that uses a lot more audio or the one that uses a lot more images. But really just, try and come up with ways to distinguish your letter pairs. A lot of people have trouble with the letter pair starting with X and the letter pair starting with Q, so it'll most likely help you to make a list at least of those. A couple techniques for especially dealing with X here. One technique is to use as many dirty words as possible with X. So for example, for XF, I would think of the dirtiest word I can that starts with F. I don't know what that could be, and stuff like that. And so another way is to just choose a genre. For example, for all of your X words, you could have something starting with the second letter that has to do with, for example, Star Wars. So for example, if you get XL, that could be a lightsaber. And if you get XW, that could be a Wookiee or something like that. Mine is kind of a mixture of things. I just sort of, like, I have this shin thing, I have ones that are like bad words, and I have all sorts of stuff. And so, just finding these little tricks is a good thing to do, and just sort of make the system into a system that's solid for you. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is just twisted corners and flipped edges. So for me, since I memorize my corners with images, each of my sort of corner twists has its own image. And some of them share images, but you sort of get the idea. And so that's something I just add. Like I'll add, so here I wouldn't do the pie that Joe eats has an extra large bok choy on it. I would do the pie that Joe eats has an extra large chameleon on it, because my memorization for this corner twist is a chameleon. So, but that's obviously for when you're more advanced and you have algorithms that twist corners and flip edges. I have a video on that, which you can look at on my channel. If you want to learn algorithms instead of just targeting one sticker on the piece and then targeting another. And so there's that kind of thing. For edges especially, if you're using audio edges, I really recommend that you just memorize your flipped pieces visually. I know I said I sort of hate visual memorization for actually memorizing corners and edges, but for me it works really well. I'll just so my edge memo, imagining I had this memo and, like, for example, if this edge were flipped, I would just say that string and I would tap the flipped edge. And so, okay, for me, memorizing one piece or two flipped edges or something using taps or visual or whatever is really manageable. I think that people often run into trouble when they try to memorize the whole cube or all the corners or all the edges using visual or tapping. So play around with these letter pair techniques. You should be ready at this point to do your first blind solve. The next video is not really going to teach anything new. It's just going to be about, how to improve yourself. It's going to teach some new, a little more advanced techniques. But, leave your questions below, and you guys should be ready to do your first blind solves. Good luck.